in time of war and then in the aftermath of war, I think societies need cultural stereotypes. I think they need models of what they see as, or at least they did in those days, as what they saw as being very fine. I guess we do today as well. What was best and most fine and most noble about that war, because they were asking so many questions about why it even happened and why it had led to such carnage, that I think people needed those heroic stereotypes. And they had the stereotype of the soldier, the combatant, who went through so much and may have been severely wounded and may have been maimed by the war. And they had those, some of them very noble stereotypes and some of them very poignant ones. That was the male stereotype, but I think society needed a female one as well. And the VAD was the obvious one, because they'd stepped out of their drawing rooms, their normal life, their everyday life, out of a life that was very protected, actually, into a life of danger, of hardship. They lived in conditions they could never have imagined previously, in tents or in huts. So they were seen as really heroic, partly for that reason. But it was recognised that they had saved a lot of lives. You can't save lives without nurses. Doctors do a lot to save lives, but that can't happen without nurses as well. But I think the myth, the heroic myth, and the myth that it was all about the VAD also had a lot to do with their image, actually, just the image of the nurse. The VAD nurses had a much more striking uniform than the trained nurses in some ways. They had a blue dress and a very starched white apron and a head scarf, that was tied at the back, but, a very kind of clean white headscarf. Photography was rather well done at the time. For its time, it was becoming quite advanced. So beautiful portrait photographs of VAD nurses came out on postcards. Actually, the French did the most remarkable postcards. They did incredibly romantic postcards. The British produced these portrait postcards. You didn't get the colour, you didn't get the red, white and blue, it was all sepia. But they were very beautiful, almost like movie stars from the silent movies. And I think it just captured the imagination of the whole nation, that people saw this as the model for heroic womanhood, like the soldier was the model for male, heroism. The interesting thing about the British and the British culture is that that image of the VAD was perpetuated for 100 years. We've had it in the background to our culture ever since the war. The most famous one, and the one that had the most impact, was Vera Britton's Testament of Youth. That's such a moving book. It's so poignant. It's mostly about her loss, about how she loses her brother and her fiancé and two of her friends. And it's mostly a pacifist text about how war shouldn't happen. But one of the things that really captures the imagination in that book is her work as a VAD nurse. But I think it's the very poignancy and humanitarian quality of her book that made it so famous. I mean, it was rightly recognised as a classic of the 20th century, and children in schools read it. So it was the VADs who wrote memoirs rather than the nurses. Not many nurses wrote memoirs. VADs did. They were fascinated by what had happened during the war and they wanted to actually give voice to that. They also were usually very well educated through governesses at home and in schools, in private schools. So they were good writers. They wrote really well. So their books really captured a readership, and it was the VAD's voice. It was the one that was heard. And then, yes, there were other authors. If men wanted to write books about that included nurses, wartime nurses, they tended to include the very stereotyped volunteer nurse rather than the professional nurse. They wanted the softer image of the volunteer nurse rather than the strict army nurse. And so Ernest Hemingway actually produces this image, Actually, Hemingway's nurse was trained. She was a trained nurse, but Catherine Barclay was like no other nurse, no real nurse you would have imagined at the time. You know, she was very much more like the image of the volunteer nurse. And Boris Pasternak wrote Dr. Zhivago, of course, and his nurse, Lara, she was a volunteer nurse who seems to have been able to do everything after just 6 weeks training. You know, so those images, Barclay and Larissa Antipova, are very romantic images. It's about the romance rather than about the nursing itself. So you've got the two sides. You've got Vera Brittain and Irene Rathbone talking about the actual nursing, but you've also got male authors being fascinated by the romantic image of the nurse and putting that forward and portraying that. And then later in the 20th century, we've had a lot of television dramas about nurses as well. And Downton Abbey was the most watched. I think it's probably been watched across the world, Downton Abbey, and the series which portrays that family moving through the First World War, actually has a VAD in it, Lady Sybil. And then very recently, last year, we had a BBC drama called The Crimson Field, which redressed the balance a bit because there are some really interesting professional nurses in that drama. But it's really interesting that the heroines are still the VADs. It's still the struggle of the VAD that you get through that drama.